Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Eric. I'm continuing my series on science fiction films of the 1980s, and today I'm going to talk about one of the final, maybe the last major release, science fiction movie released of the 1980s, which was Back to the Future 2, released in November of 1989. Of course, the sequel to the 1985 classic. Directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Zemeckis and Bob Gale, produced by Steven Spielberg. Most of the old cast is back, and really we have a direct continuation of the original film, really picking up from there. This might be my favorite of the trilogy, and if you really look at this movie closely, it's by far the darkest story of the trilogy, and I'll talk about that, why I think it's the darkest one. But just quickly on the plot, so we pick up at the end of the previous film. Doc returns from the future and tells Marty and Jennifer that they have to go with him into the future. And as we learn, it's the year 2015, and there are problems with Marty's family. He's married to Jennifer, and they have to fix that problem. Then we have the big plot point, the big MacGuffin of the story is a sports almanac, which old Biff in 2015 steals this almanac, steals a time machine, goes back to 1955, gives it to his younger self, which allows Biff to amass a fortune and basically take over Hill Valley, where in the story Biff has become like a Hugh Hefner, Donald Trump type figure, and he completely runs the town. He's married to Marty's mom, Lorraine, and it's just a terrible situation in Hill Valley. So we've entered this dark timeline, or skewed into the tangent, as Doc says. And the rest of the film is about trying to get the book back, and that's the struggle. So the film does a lot of clever things, I think, as far as moving the story along and then moving us into the next one, part 3, which these films were done back to back, where 2 was done and then they went right in and worked on part 3. And both films are very much different. Part 3 is very more elegiac, wrapping up the story, but 2 is the one that really embraces a lot of chaos, a lot of darkness that we get in part 2. One of the things in this story is where we learn about Marty in 2015, where he's now in his 40s, and he's not doing so well. He's going to lose his job. We learned that his ambitions to become a guitar player never happened. So he's, kind of living this, I don't know. He's become like an office drone, is what it looks like. And it kind of presents that question, though, like, what if somebody went up to you when you were a teenager, 17, 18 years old, and, hey, do you want to see where you're going to be 30 years from now? How many of you would take up that offer? And what if you did take up that offer and you saw a version of yourself 30 years later and you did not like what you've seen, right? I mean, that's existentially pretty terrifying, and that's one of the darker, I think, elements of the film. There's also this idea of broken timelines and how quickly a timeline can, as I say again, skew into a tangent. And as we go into this kind of really dystopian 1985, where it's a far cry from what we know of the present 1985. So the whole sense of alternate realities and how fragile realities can be, how just back to that butterfly effect idea, how one slight change in direction, you go left instead of right, right instead of left, and the timeline can change, right? So that's one of those. And this is one of the earlier time travel films that really get into paradoxes, and really future time travel films would do that, but 2, for a mainstream movie, and there have been precursors, but yeah, this whole idea of paradoxes and doubles. If you could be in a timeline where there's a different version of yourself at a different time, maybe a different age, and of course this film does that in the climax where Marty has the version of himself from the previous film is there, and Doc has that too, and the whole business of um, if you see each other, the space time continuum could destroy itself. So, some heavy stuff, heavy existential stuff, good for comedy, but kind of dark. And to kind of continue along that line, the film gets into how dangerous time travel can be if you think about it to its logical conclusion. This film's in conversation with other time travel stories, like I guess H.G. Wells, the first famous novel. I've covered that, or the film version of it, on an earlier video, but that's just like one guy traveling through time, and he witnesses all these changes in humanity, and and is more of an observer, really. But Back to the Future 2 really gets into paradoxes and how confusing time travel can be. It's no longer much of an adventure in this film. Marty and Doc are on damage control for most of this movie, trying to fix all of the broken timeline. So I think this film in particular, I think, did influence other movies in that way, like Looper, or even the Avengers, Infinity Wars film. I think they even reference Back to the Future Part 2 in that, or even like a Donnie Darko, or movies like that would come later. So this was a script that I think did, for a mainstream movie, went places with the time travel concept that maybe others hadn't quite done before. So yeah, there's kind of like a real horror almost in this film of timelines changing, and what if you found yourself trapped in the wrong time period, or what if this whole idea, this motif in the film of futures changing, where they look, well, that kind of dates the film. They're looking at a newspaper and they burn the book, and the newspaper changes, and or even the whole idea of being erased from existence, which happens to old Biff in the film. I think that scene was cut. I know you can find that on YouTube, but yeah, that whole idea of being erased from existence. So the film really explores how time travel can be just this really complicated and dangerous thing, and of course, like I said, a lot of future stories would take that much further. Interesting to think about Back to the Future 2 as the end of the 80s, and another favorite scene is the Cafe 80s in the future of 2015, which was kind of prophetic. That we could say any film that tries to look, that does, this is what the year 20 whatever is going to look like, and usually there'll be a couple of hits, but mostly misses. But the whole 80s nostalgia thing, which really started taking off, I think, in the 2000s and into the 2010s, of just a massive wave of nostalgia for the 80s, and I like in this film kind of predicted that with the cafe, and there's Ronald Reagan taking orders, and Michael Jackson, and all these pop culture references to 80s music and TV and everything. So that was clever in a way. And the future in this movie, I remember, like, this is what, 11 years ago now, when the actual 2015 arrived, and people were comparing what the actual 2015 looked like, and how, we don't have flying cars, we don't have hoverboards, or supposedly. I know that's a whole conspiracy theory thing, but we don't, our future doesn't look like, we haven't gone vertical yet, where we have skyways, and that are accessible to everybody. But in some ways, though, in the film, there's a lot of screens, a lot of a very much a commercialized society, like the whole Jaws 19 thing, where like, that's Spielberg, even kind of satirizing himself a little bit there, and so there are some flashes of this 2015 in the film. It does seem to be a bit more impersonal. Technology hasn't really solved everything yet, as it's not that it ever was or would could solve everything, but I think to take a hard look of how this film imagines the future. I mean, some of it looks really cool and interesting, or maybe it looks dated now, but other parts of it do kind of make sense and a little more serious. Yeah, yeah. Like I know it's a thing. Like I'll hear younger people say, like, "Oh, the '80s, everything was just great in the '80s. Oh, it was just a, I wish I lived in the '80s. Everything just looked so fantastic then." And I'm like, no, I mean, the '80s were not perfect by any means at all. There were serious issues in the '80s, and I think if you go back and watch films of the '80s, you can see this. Here's in the movies of the '80s, everything just looks so great. And really, what movies are you watching? I would say, there's a number that I've talked about in these videos. There's just such a number of issues throughout the 1980s that it wasn't not at all this perfect time. So I think watching the Back to the Future movies is a good way to have that discussion about nostalgia and how we remember the past. So, but yeah, the film itself. I mean, Zemeckis is really on fire here. I think Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, just start watching them on screen together. Come on, I mean, just watching those two guys interact is great. There's the cinematographer Dean Cundey, one of my favorite cinematographers. Just a real kind of almost like a pop art look sometimes that he has to his films. Back to the Future films, anyway. So I love the look of this film, and yeah, so just. Yeah, really, everyone's really firing on all cylinders here. So, yeah, and as I said at the end, we get the trailer right for the next film. So, but yeah, it seems like a real suitable ending point for the 1980s. I think which just a few brief reflections on science fiction in the 80s. Just a really pivotal decade, no doubt. One of the big differences I noticed was when I went through the 70s, I tended to talk about politics more in my reviews. I noticed I got a lot more dislikes when I talked about the 70s because the 70s movies were more political and a little bit more. We're in the part of the era and with Vietnam, Watergate, environmental concerns, all that. In the 80s, though, it's different, though, because there's definitely a political edge to the films of the 80s, but it's not so, it's a little more subtle with some films in the 80s, so I found that interesting. Not that films in the 80s were not political. They were. A lot of them very much were. The Back to the Future films were political, and I think I don't want to go too much into that discussion. Maybe I'll wait to part 3 as far as getting into some of the politics. But I do think with part 2, talking about that, it complicates a lot of the things in the first film. This is a film that's kind of messy and all that. I remember reading reviews, and like Siskel and Ebert would come on, and I think Ebert was like, "Oh, this movie's so confusing. I don't even know what's going on half the time." And that seemed to be the consensus on this one, is that, oh, it's too confusing. They're jumping around all the time, and it's not like kind of like this fun romp like the first one. This one's kind of all over the map. But I think as time has went on, that's kind of maybe why I'm drawn to part 2 anymore. But just kind of go back to kind of jumping all over here, but back to just kind of some other thoughts in the 80s. The year 1982, covering those films like Blade Runner and E.T. and Star Trek II and The Road Warrior, Tron, so many important films of 1982, and that's really like a bridge year from the more I don't know, like more philosophical, more sociological science fiction of the 70s. And with 82, we get big adventures, and we get spectacles, and we get really visceral visions like Blade Runner, right? Which would still, I think, Blade Runner's influence is everywhere. And actually, 1984 was a very interesting year because there were so many science fiction films released in 1984. I've been working on an essay, trying to get an essay together just focused on the sci-fi films of 1984 because there's so much to mine there. There's really not like one standout great film from 84. You can maybe think of a few. Ghostbusters is a classic if you consider that science fiction, but there were just so many varieties of sci-fi films that came out in 84. We get to the middle part of the decade, it's a little bit more it's hard to put too much of a definition on it. We have like the Amblin, the Spielberg type stuff. We see a lot of blending of genres like alienation, like a buddy cop film. We see satire like RoboCop. We have action sci-fi like Aliens and Predator. Kind of going through the greatest hits of the mid '80s here, but we're getting more of a variety. And by the time we get to the end of the decade, we start to see harbingers, of course, of what's coming. We see more CGI being used, which will become a big part of the 1990s. We see cyberpunk, and we see the genre starting to stretch out a little bit as well. On the one hand, we're still in the blockbuster era by the end of the decade, but we're also going to enter a decade where we get a lot more low-budget science fiction films and just a huge variety. Indie sci-fi films will be coming with. So I'm looking forward to doing the 90s. I have quite a few films I plan to cover. I don't know, 70 or 75 films. And one reason is we get such a variety of science fiction films in the 80s, as I was talking about, different, more international as well. And I want to talk about more international science fiction films. And just, so will be a lot to talk about. So that's a little bit of a preview of the 90s. But yeah, Back to the Future Part 2. Personally, I wouldn't say it's like the best of the series, but it's my favorite of the series. It's probably the one that I enjoy the most. So anyway, if you have any thoughts on the Back to the Future films, any thoughts on looking back at the 1980s science fiction, any thoughts you might have. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.